Okay, good morning from Washington, D.C., or good evening or good afternoon from whatever time zone you're joining us from. My name is Jeff Payne. I'm at the NESA Center and work on issues relating to the wider Indian Ocean region. This is part of an ongoing series focused on the Indian Ocean region and the Indian Ocean littoral states. And today's conversation focuses on the northwest area of that Indian Ocean region, the wider Middle East, as it's referred to in the United States. I'm joined currently by three colleagues from different time zones. Two of them are actually in the same time zone. We have Jonathan Fulton joining us from Zayed University, as well as the Atlantic Council, where he is a non-resident fellow. Meena Singh Roy, who joins us from IDSA in Delhi. And then Mohan Malik, who is currently with the United Arab Emirates National Defense College. Now, before we start and this conversation, know that not only myself, but all of the speakers today are speaking on their own behalf of their own opinions and do not represent in any way any government, any institution, or any wider affiliation. These are a group of scholars and friends discussing some issues that are currently shaping our world. So with that introduction, the conversation, the specific issue today is how the Middle Eastern states interpret or perceive the actions of what we would call the major powers. So we can define that in different ways, but certainly a list of major powers, both regional and non-regional, would include the United States, China, the collective European zone, Russia, and India, as well as potentially others. But how these countries are perceived by states, whether they be Israel, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, and so forth. The first question I'm going to ask the group of friends joining me today is this question, and it is, from a wider lens, how does the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, view the major powers that are operating and active throughout the Middle East? And since I believe he was the first in the room today, I'm going to turn to Jonathan first for his response. So Jonathan, the microphone is yours for a response.
Cool, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to see you and Mohan and Meena again. So as you said, I'm based in Abu Dhabi, and as you know, I've been tracking the China-Gulf relationships for quite some time. And being here, you can't help but compare and contrast that with the other great powers around the world that have pretty deep interest in the Gulf. So obviously I can't really speak to a Gulf perspective because it's probably pretty obvious for those watching that I'm not Khaliji. But from talking with Arab friends and Gulf friends, I guess I've kind of got a sense of how it's largely perceived in the region. About a year and a half ago, I was talking with an Emirati, a pretty astute observer, and I asked him how he saw this, at that point, kind of a nascent level of competition between the US and China. And he said, this is a great situation for us. You know, we've got Europe and the US on one side, and if we don't get what we want from them, then we've got China and Russia on the other side. And this is a really good position to be in. I don't think many people would say that anymore, because I think what we've seen over the past year is that the relationship between the US and China has deteriorated to a point worse at any point in my lifetime, really. I mean, worse than the post-Tiananmen, which, you know, kind of aging myself. I was still a kid when that happened, but that was seen as a low point, and now it's really, I guess, we've hit a new low. And what that means in the region, we've seen over the past several months that US officials have been hinting that regional actors are going to have to start making some tough choices. We saw this when Secretary Pompeo visited Israel in May and made it pretty clear that if the Israelis are going to continue to cooperate with China on sensitive sectors, then the US wouldn't be able to have the same kind of defense relationship. And there was a pretty telling quote that was in, I believe it's a Jerusalem Post story at that time, where an unnamed State Department official said, we're having the same conversation with all of our partners and allies across the region. And of course, being here in the UAE, we saw that, and our eyebrows raised quite a bit, because the UAE, obviously the central pillar of its foreign and defense policies is the US, but at the same time, The China relationship is very important economically and increasingly across a bigger array of issues as well. And I don't have to say right now, obviously COVID is a big part of that equation, where for a country like the UAE or for other Middle Eastern countries that have traditionally looked points west for support on initiatives, traditional partners or allies like the UK or the US have really bungled their COVID response. Whereas China, I get why there would be a lot of concern about how they've handled it, especially in the early stage. But from the Gulf, it seems to be one of the few regions that you don't hear a negative perception. I'm sure it'll come up at some point in the conversation that Pew released some data today saying that most Western countries have the lowest perception of China that they've had since they started tracking this data. You don't see that in the Middle East so much. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because people here, for one thing, that survey didn't include Middle Eastern respondents. We also know that most of the media is state-owned here, and that people are a little less willing to speak openly on social media about politically sensitive issues. But at the same time, China's working very closely with a lot of countries around here on vaccine trials. They've provided PPE, they're providing testing and tracing. They've really stepped up. So what I'm seeing, and from talking to Emiratis specifically, is nobody wants to be put in this position of having to choose one side or the other. Beijing and DC see everything right now in this great power competition lens. I keep hearing about this new Cold War. I keep hearing this crazy language like decoupling, as if that's even possible with the economies integrated the way they are. But it seems to be, I think, really an election-driven narrative, but it's a very popular one. Meanwhile, here in the region, nobody's talking like that. They're talking about regional, local issues that need to be solved, and whether they can be solved by working with the US, or whether they can be solved by working with China, or India, or Europe, or Russia, or as we've seen with the Abraham Accords, with non-traditional partners or allies, or normalizing relations with other countries. I think what they're more interested in is dealing with the more immediate issues, and this great power narrative just really doesn't resonate here. I think it makes people very uncomfortable.
Okay, already I have follow-ups to that that I want to ask, but you're getting into some of the issues that we're talking about when we get into perception, the framing of this as a Cold War, concept of decoupling, picking between the two, at least when it comes to the U.S.-China dynamic. But we're gonna hold for that so we can continue on and add to the complexity you've already introduced. Meena, you were second in the room, so I will turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, when we look at the major power who are involved in the Middle East today, I see a completely new Middle East now, where the perceptions are there, but the hard reality is that China may not be the most favored kind of a country, a reliable partner, but at the same time, it offers opportunities and options to the countries. And from the regional perspective, I feel that the countries are more looking at the multi-vector policy. They want to have the best from each actor which is present and has a role to play in the region. That's how we look at it. And my interactions with many, regional experts or, the citizens who have, and the youth particularly, they still feel that the United States, is more reliable partner. Maybe the US is not willing to play the same role that they have played in past. Yet, it is one, probably actor which is seen to be providing some kind of a security guarantee. Now, they also talk about, saying that, this is the kind of an insurance company for us where we pay and we get some sort of a this is one that I've heard from some of them. As far as Russia is concerned, I think it is a new player, and as I said, the most of the countries, those who are looking at Russia, and here again, Each country has a different perception. I mean, if we are talking about the GCC countries, they have a different perception about Russia, China, and United States. When we talk about Iraq, when we talk about Iran, when we talk about, for example, Jordan and the other, North African countries, there again, the perception would be somewhat different. So there isn't a single, line that you can draw and say, this is the common perception of the Middle Eastern countries or MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. I think these are based on the developments which are taking, the new developments, I would say, the new Middle East, which I can see unfolding today, with Israel being, recognized by UAE and Bahrain. Now, this is a new development which, of course, nobody expected. So to come up like this, but under the circumstances when each country, I think, is looking at what an individual player can offer them, their equations would be probably developed based on each country's capacity, capability, both in terms of economic cooperation, in terms of security and defense. I think that is where they have been selective about. So it would be a kind of a cooperation where these countries would look at their internal situation, where we would see the new social contract, so it would be about the regime security, it would be about the satisfying, the aspirations of the people, especially the youth. However, when we put, Russia, Iran, and China with Iraq and Syria and Libya, things would be different, I guess. So here, Turkey would see United States in a different way. When we talk about Iran, the perceptions are completely different. So I don't think there is a single kind of a perception that we can say this is a common perception of the regional countries. That could have been the scene maybe 10 years back, but not today.
I definitely want to hear about India in this, and they definitely play a part. Mohan, to you. You are the last up, but I'm sure you're going to add further complexity to the already complex picture we have.
Thanks for having me join the discussion. I would be about regional dynamics of regional powers and their links with great powers. As John said before, there is a great deal of anxiety, but at the same time opportunities, as well as unease in terms of US-China competition. They want to exploit this to their benefit, countries in the region. What is happening is that there is a great deal of uncertainty about great powers' support for regional hegemons, so to speak. Turkey, for example, who is backing Turkey in its expansionist drive in the Mediterranean as well as in the Gulf. What support Iran is getting from China and Russia, and how much support GCC countries, old Gulf allies of the US, can get faced with growing great power competition at the global level between the US and China, and at the regional level, in particular, Russia is supporting, Russia is supporting Iran as well as Turkey to some extent. So whether traditional US can count on the US for support.
Sorry, Mohan, I'm not getting a connection from you. We'll return to you. The reality of digital connectivity. We have to be flexible. So, given what I've heard from everyone, we have a situation from an analytical point of view where we have various regional actors all involved in various elements of competition. The internal Gulf competition. You have Turkey navigating a new path for itself, seeing itself leader. The open question about what's going to happen with North Africa, how Egypt is interacting with the countries to its south, especially over competition over the waters of the Nile, the ongoing Yemen conflict, and then obviously just the importance of the Gulf itself as a major resource-driven region of the planet. That's on one side. On the other side, obviously, all the major powers, whether they be regional or not, seeking to have some type of influence there, either by necessity, by tradition, or for geopolitical concerns. But I want to return to something Jonathan brought up, and that is this frame, specifically as it relates to the U.S.-China dynamic of a Cold War between the U.S. and China. That frame, has that frame, the way you see it, whether it be in Delhi or in the Middle East, has that frame caught on? Are people talking about U.S.-China competition in a Cold War dynamic? I can speak that it is increasingly discussed in the United States as one. I find that to be, quite honestly, inaccurate and dangerous because it does not fit that model in any way, shape, or form, other than you have two major powers kind of spitting at each other diplomatically. But how are these kind of this competitive relationship between the U.S. and China being conceptualized either by media or by the leadership of countries? What is your response to that? Meena, if you don't mind, we'll start to you so you can bring in some of the perspectives from Delhi. I think that would be interesting.
I think US-China competition is much talked about, issue as far as media is concerned, our academic community is concerned, even otherwise. The US-China competition, here there are sort of a few narratives. One narrative is that when we talk about the US-China competition, say in Middle East or in East Asia or in Southern Asia, when we talk about, and India is going through a period where there are problems, on our borders, and there is not a very easy relationship between India and China at present, and therefore, it is considered that United States is the most reliable partner when we are talking about India. I mean, often what you hear is that China is very, very aggressive when it be it Southern Asia. When we say Southern Asia, we include Afghanistan as such. So China's influence and aggressive posturing and its strategies that it has adopted vis-a-vis India in Southern Asia, in not so much in Middle East. I think in Middle East, India has its own dynamics and its own connections based on its past linkages, and also it's a completely different dynamics. But when we talk about Southern Asia and East Asia, things are very, very different, and therefore China is definitely this competition is seen as the concern, but also as an opportunity where India sees much more common, I would say, approach as far as United States and India are concerned. So this is how it is viewed. As far as West Asia is concerned, I think India has its own strength when it comes to Middle East. As I said, China, is often viewed not as a very welcome partner, welcome in a sense that it offers certain opportunity which makes it a desirable partner for these regional countries. But there isn't any trust in terms of, India is seen more as a benign power, which is genuinely, looking at the developmental partnership. Whereas China is seen more as a country which is aggressive, but which can bring economic incentives and benefits to the region. And therefore, I have always said India need not, compete in that sense, but it has to build on its own strengths. And that, along with the like-minded partners, like United States and Japan and Korea, Australia. I think this is where, you would see, and as I see it, you call it competition, you call it shadow boxing, or in terms of, I don't foresee a kind of a conflict which would come, but yes, there would be some sort of a engagement, between and amongst the powers who wants to sort of balance the increasing aggressive Chinese posturing that you see today.
That's incredibly helpful for the context from Delhi's point of view, and bringing in the other kind of Asian actors, Korea, Japan, and what they are interested in, what they can do. There's open questions there. Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you, and then Mohan will go back to you to allow you the chance to finish your first answer. But Jonathan, right now, I'll turn it to you.
Great. So, yeah, I mean, to your question, is this Cold War narrative catching over here? No. Like I said in my earlier answer, folks here are completely obsessed with regional questions. And when they're looking at issues of China and the US or Europe or India or Russia or Japan or what have you, it's mostly in terms of who can we use partnerships with to try to achieve what it is we want to solve here. This idea of a Cold War is really, I think, a DC idea. You'll guess, I mean, from probably my face, I'm really bad at hiding what I'm thinking. This Cold War idea to me is a really lazy construct. It drives me crazy when I hear it. I think it's a result, what we've seen, a lot of the big security or strategic documents that have come out of the US during the Trump administration, whether it's the White House National Security document from 2017 or the DoD one. I mean, they've mostly come from the military. We're not seeing stuff from the state, for example, or from non-military approaches to these diplomatic issues. So, of course, when you've got a hammer as your only tool, everything's a nail, right? Which makes this Cold War, it's a way to maybe drive up funding for military projects, or maybe it's just a way to try to keep China, I guess, maybe contained a little bit. I mean, for a reason, I'm not trying to come across like a panda hugger or a panda slugger. I'm just trying to look at it from their perspective. And really, I think with the idea of a Cold War, I mean, in this case, what we had was two competing ideologies from two major powers that divided the world up into these different spheres of influence, where economies didn't integrate, that there was almost no connection. It was very rare that people met with each other. You look at the situation now, and you've got all these students going back and forth. You've got businesses doing trade everywhere. It's not like a Cold War where you could just split the world and say, pick a side. Everything is just so densely integrated that really a Cold War, I think, is just a very, very dangerous and frankly dumb way to look at a very complicated situation. I think where it's interesting, because what we see is countries that are having the strongest reactions to China's rise tend to be democracies. You look at most countries in Europe, for example, or in the US, or Australia, New Zealand, India, or Canada, where I'm from, most of these countries have had pretty rough go with China over the past little while. I don't think that's a coincidence. Meanwhile, you look at countries that look at the China model as clumsy as that expression may be, but exporting a state-driven capitalist economy with very heavy involvement in government in the state, supporting authoritarian tendencies. That's very attractive in a lot of places. The Middle East is one of them, where places with weak state capacity or a lot of underdevelopment look at China pre-1978 and see what kind of shape it was in, and then they look at what China looks like now and think, oh my God, how do we get that? And if I could get that and not have to switch to a democracy and share power with, political Islamist groups or whatever fringe group, Daesh or something, give me that. I want it, So I guess when we think of a Cold War mentality, maybe it is this competition between competing regime types, which I think is pretty interesting. But the idea that, great powers are competing with this Thucydides trap nonsense, I don't think that really has much very useful to tell us. We looked at what is it that makes China attractive as a partner for a lot of these countries, and what is it that gets our hackles up about China's rise. That might lead to more useful, relevant policy conversations.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'll make sure to send your review of Graham Allison's work to him about his recent book. Anyway, Mohan, we lost you for a second. You're back on, so I'll let you respond to the first question, and then also we're talking about this whole dynamic of why this Cold War perception has risen when it comes to U.S. and China, and how that matters in the Middle East region. And then after that, I'll turn it to my colleague Anne Moizan, who has her hand up and wants to jump into the conversation. So Mohan, to you first.
My apologies for the weak Wi-Fi connection. We've been having trouble in our compound lately with the internet connection. So I would fully agree with what John has said. Countries in the region are quite relaxed about this competition. Actually, they welcome it, and they want to play to their advantage. If there's any concern, it's more about the U.S. staying power in the region, what U.S. brings to these countries than China. They would like Chinese investments, port development is something looking at, in terms of diversification of the economies to generate employment, industrial parks. That's what they're looking at, and China is going to invest in those areas. Countries like UAE or Saudi Arabia, they are not in the same situation as poor developing countries in South Asia, in parts of Africa. They can negotiate on their terms with the Chinese. So they are not going to allow large number of Chinese workers brought into the country to work on those projects. China can do that in Iran, for example, but China cannot, force these countries to accept its terms when it comes to infrastructure development projects. These countries don't need Chinese loans. So they are very rich countries, sovereign wealth funds, they are using sovereign wealth funds to finance these infrastructure projects. So a part of diversification economy. So they would welcome Chinese engineering capabilities, infrastructure development, port development, especially industrial parks. And in that respect, US or Western countries do not have much to offer to these countries. China has more to offer. They are concerned about the US-China competition. They don't want to get caught up in this competition. They acknowledge that this competition is going to affect them in some ways, but they want to insulate themselves. In fact, they want to be they want to play both sides, just as during the Cold War, non-aligned countries played both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, to their advantage. That's what at least GCC countries, I'm not talking about North Africa, I'm not talking about Eastern Africa, I'm not talking about Yemen, I'm talking about Iraq for that matter, I'm talking more about GCC countries. They see more opportunities from the US-China competition than challenges. They are less worried about this competition impinging upon their interests. It plays to their advantage in terms of what they want from both the U.S. to strengthen security presence. They want the U.S. to maintain security presence, not leave the region to regional powers. They're more concerned about Iran and Turkey, what they are doing. Especially Saudi Arabia, they are concerned about what they are doing and what kind of support. If there's some concern, it's more about how much support Iran or Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE's rivals, are going to get from China, Russia. That's what concerns them, not so much US-China competition at the global level. That doesn't concern them. So there's a different kind of anxiety at the regional level, what regional hegemons, so to speak, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia are doing vis-a-vis each other, and how is that going to impact not the US-China global rivalry competition. So that's one. Second is this alignments are in a state of flux. there is a degree of concern that if China and Iran go through this deal that they have talked about. New York Times published a big story on $400 billion deal, 25 years, over a period of 25 years. This is China's oil for security and growth deal with Iran. How would that affect the regional balance of power within the GCC and in the broader MENA region? So that's a cause for concern over the long term, not in the short term, because Iran has a very weak hand compared with other powers. That's very well acknowledged economically, commercially speaking. That Iran could lease a port, Jask port, that has been talked about. Then China acquires military presence on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz, Gwadar, Jask, and Dukam. So that's a concern over the long term. This rivalry, how would it impinge upon? But they also are quite conscious that China wants to remain friends to everyone, allies with none. So if China maintains that policy, then there is not much to worry about for the GCC countries. So that's at a very, I would say, at the elite level. It's as far as the businesses, commercial enterprises are concerned, they would welcome Chinese investments, and countries in the region want Chinese assistance into finding a cure for the pandemic so that they can get on with their lives. Vaccine development, they're collaborating with China too. So the concern that you see, John mentioned Pew opinion polls, that level of concern is not here in this part of the world about the US-China competition, that negative. Yeah, Chinese soft power has certainly taken a beating, Chinese soft power has suffered as a result of its mishandling of the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic. Make no mistake about it. There is a great deal of if you talk to people on the street, they're surprised by what China did. The masking of the whole world, how the economic damage that it has caused to all countries, big and small. Every country is going to emerge as a weakened power because of this prolonged, impact, socio-economic impact of the pandemic. We don't know how long it will take to get over this pandemic. So this concern is more at the economic level. But in terms of geopolitics, I don't think that's going to be reflected in Gulf countries' relations with the US and China. They want to have both on their side and play accordingly. What is another, in terms of from a US perspective, the major concern is that these countries are allowing Chinese companies like Huawei, ZTE, becoming part of China's digital Silk Road. So that creates security risks for interoperability, arms sales to these countries, and UAE, Saudi Arabia, they expect the US to transfer state-of-the-art weapon systems, but if they allow China, greater presence, Chinese telecommunication companies get a presence in those countries, that will certainly impinge upon their security ties with the US. So on the one hand, they say that they want the US to maintain its security presence in the region. On the other hand, as a consequence, indirect consequence of unintended consequence of China's greater economic footprint in the region would be on the state of military ties the Gulf countries enjoy with the US.
Thank you, Mohan. That's glad you were able to merge both answers together. To not only to toot my own horn a little bit, I wrote a piece for the Australian National University on the repercussions of the possible deal, and I called it unforeseen costs for every actor involved, which is always true in the Middle East. But anyway, Anne, you've been very patient. Your hand is up. I'm going to turn to you to allow you to jump into the conversation. Microphone to you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I've heard Jonathan speak on a number of different occasions, and he is Gulf pragmatic, if at best. So I always appreciate his candidness and honesty on that. My question is the fact that in Washington, D.C. now, there is a real push that, especially if Biden is elected, that there be a rebalancing with China between cooperation and competition, avoiding a direct conflict. But how do the countries of the region feel about what would they want to see in that new rebalancing? And will the U.S. continue to be seen through the lens of security only, okay, rather than with what a Biden administration is anticipated to have, more in the sense of an alignment based on values? Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. That actually is a great entry point into the next question I have, but I will allow everyone to jump in to respond to that question. Who wants to go first?
I'll take a stab. There's a lot in that one, but great, Ann. Thanks. Nice to meet you here. To the question of what a Biden administration would do differently, I can't really speak to in any kind of expertise. I imagine one thing that we'd see different is that the State Department has seemed to have played been relegated to a minor role under the Trump administration. And we've seen a lot of really great people in the State Department, a lot of Asia hands, China hands that haven't been playing as much of a role in shaping policy. And I don't expect that the Democrats would have a less aggressive policy towards China, but I would expect to see that the State Department would have a bigger role in shaping things, and that might create opportunities for different policy choices rather than, again, looking at everything like kind of a military situation. For the Gulf, I think what we've seen, especially Mohan mentioned rightfully a lot about the digital question and Huawei and the 5G situation. I think what's happened in this region over the past several years, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, I've been in the Gulf for a long time. I came here in 2006. And before I came here, I lived in Asia for about 7 or 8 years. So I didn't come here as a Middle East guy. I came here as an Asia guy. And what struck me quite early on was this kind of beneath the surface, this deep Asian presence, East Asian presence, I should clarify, of, there was this growing Korean commercial presence that grew in with the nuclear deal in 2009. But with China, it was never talked about. It was just seen as an American lake, essentially. And we've seen, when I started doing my dissertation in 2011, I talked to somebody from the States about it, and he said, you're never going to get a dissertation out of this topic. There's no way there's 100,000 words in China-Gulf relations. And by the time I finished, obviously, I either looked really lucky or really prescient, but I think it's really just been about the past year and a half or 2 years where I think people in Washington have realized that China's quietly gone from being the place that buys a lot of oil to the place that buys a lot of oil and gas and sells a lot of stuff and gets a lot of contracts and is providing all these other services. And it's not just oil for cheap products relationship. It's a very diverse, multifaceted one. And China has very quietly moved into the region in a big way. And as I said, I think Washington came to this realization quite late. And you can see when John Bolton or Mike Pompeo last year were quite aggressively trying to get Middle Eastern countries to not engage with Huawei on 5G networks, it was after the fact. I mean, a lot of them had already signed contracts or MOUs. And at that point, Huawei had been cooperating with Saudi for something like 4 years already. Like, it wasn't a prospective cooperation. It was an established relationship. And then I think the U.S. came to this realization that it was happening and said, look, you got to stop. Now, I think the issue with this is that when you talk to people in lesser developed countries, they would almost all say, yeah, we would rather cooperate with the U.S. on this than China, but we can't afford it. Now, the Gulf is different, obviously. They can afford whatever they want. But what they need in the Gulf is they need to engage all these extra-regional powers in a lot of different ways, because there's a very, very real fear of abandonment here. It doesn't square with the arms sales or the bases or the troop numbers. But the fact is, every president, whether it was Obama or Clinton or Trump, Bush being the outlier with the war in Iraq, all these countries or all these presidents have been saying, look, we want a less deep Middle East Gulf footprint. we don't want to be there so deeply. Whether it's Obama's pivot or whether it's Trump saying, let's develop this Middle East strategic alliance so you can take a bigger role in providing your own security, and we don't have to. Actors here hear this, and they think, we have to take it seriously. The U.S. keeps saying, when Martin Indyk wrote that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in January, saying, I believe the title was, "The Middle East Isn't Worth It Anymore." This guy's whole career was engage the Middle East, and now he's saying, I'm throwing up my hands, I give up. Everybody here sees this and thinks we have to make provisions for a point where the U.S. might not be as committed as they were in the past. And again, you see the sales, you see the troop numbers here, you see all the other stuff, and you think it's not likely, and maybe it isn't, but it would be very irresponsible for policymakers to not take it seriously. So, they can't cooperate with China on defense or security issues because it would alienate the alliance with the U.S. They can work with on that, work towards their development or their vision goals, like smart city tech, or like nuclear energy, or like renewables, or COVID treatment, things that aren't directly linked, or in the past hadn't been directly linked, or hadn't been securitized. And right now they are. I think what everybody would like to see is some kind of discussion between American, Chinese, and Middle East stakeholders to say, what is it? We understand everybody's got their own interests. How can we function in this very crowded region without stepping on each other's toes and starting something from spiraling? I think everybody would agree competition is healthy and great, but there's no need for it to turn into a conflict. And I think really what it is just there's got to be dialogue. There should be track two narratives happening all the time where different folks that have policy influence are able to go back to their governments and say, I just talked to a bunch of people from Beijing and Washington and Abu Dhabi, and this is what's driving their decisions. Because right now I think everybody's acting in silos and not really talking with each other.
Well said, and I have an American focused question that I need to ask, but I'm going to. I know both Meena and Mohan will have additionally well said points to make. So we'll go first to Mohan, and then we'll go to Meena, if that's okay. Mohan, any response to Anne's question?
Whether there is a change in administration or not, I believe that US and China share three major concerns in the Middle East. The safety of sea lanes of communication. They favor regional status quo. They don't want a major change, and they do not want a conflict to break out in the region. So they oppose Iran, Saudi Arabia, this tensions. They want to keep a lid on that, manage that. Competition is okay, but conflict is not. So that's where US and China have common concerns. At the same time, this Cold War or not, whatever you want to call it, US-China tensions are going to affect, as I said before, not in the economic arena, and not so much in the energy sector, but in the high-tech sector, new emerging technologies, AI, digital Silk Road. That's one area of concern because you're going to see the emergence of two distinct rival digital blocks. So whether countries in the region are going to opt for Chinese technologies, Chinese technology standards, Chinese Baidu, navigation system, and its security implications of technological applications that they choose today, long-term security implications, that would have some impact on their political and military relationship with the US. So that's where if the pressure is going to come from, it's not so much from Washington, DC on these countries, on its old allies, it's from Beijing. China is going to pressure these countries to opt for Chinese technologies, Chinese companies, telecommunication, and that's will be a tough choice for these countries, to make. Also, I'm a student of geopolitics, and I believe that the logic of geopolitics, and that's what I say in my lectures here too, my presentations, that the logic of geopolitics dictates that Middle East remains one of the key geographic pivots of world politics. There is just no escape, much as US would like to leave the Middle East to its own devices because it's engaged in competition with China and it leave the Middle East to China. US may not need oil and gas from the Middle East. But the fact of the matter is, US, Asian allies, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, India, after China, these are the largest buyers of Middle Eastern oil. US cannot let China dominate the Middle Eastern region because its Asian allies are even more dependent on the Middle East for their energy needs to fuel economic growth. So actually, China's growing footprint in the region is going to halt American retreat, so to speak, if there is. I don't believe there's any retreat. America turning its back on the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, because US-China competition now runs through all parts of the world, especially the Middle East and the South China Sea. It's Western Pacific and the Middle East. These are two interlinked regions in terms of their importance, whether in security or in global economy. And that makes it very difficult for any administration, whether it's a Trump administration or the Biden administration, to turn its back on the Middle East. It's not going to happen. This part of the world cannot be left to America's global competitors.
Thanks, Mohan. Excellent reminders too of the tanglement that happens when you step into the Middle East. It's almost like quicksand or super glue. Meena, to you for your thoughts on Anne's question.
Yeah, thank you. I think what Anne asked was will there be a kind of a rebalancing with China if there is a change in the US administration? I feel there would be some change. Definitely that has to come because if you look at the debate as far as Joe Biden is concerned, I think there might be some changes when we are talking about the Iran issue, and that might get reflected in many ways in a different way. But I do feel that there would be some kind of a rebalancing if there is change in the administration. It is not going to be the same. But this doesn't mean that the US-China competition is going to die down. For the reasons that Professor Mohan Malik explained and opportunities which the Chinese offer to them. But I would say they still look towards United States as a security provider. I don't think they would want United States to, sort of play down that role. Even though if they have to share the burden, they would be probably willing to do it. I mean, one is the security, and other is the, as Professor Mohan Malik said, that the high technology, the artificial intelligence, and other aspects. Is it the Chinese technology or the Western technology which is more suited to them? My own understanding is, forget about the GCC countries. Even if you talk to the Iranians, if the US-Iran relations get better, we don't know whether they would or not. But if they do, then even the Iranians would very much want the European technology, the German technology, the US technology, and not the Chinese ones. That is what I feel. I mean, they are highly Eurocentric. So that goes without. That's my experience talking to the youngsters in the Iran. And you name the Middle Eastern country. I mean, they are all looking towards Europe and United States, but China is compulsion today. So that's how it is. But they would still want the modern weapons which they can get from United States and Europe, and not so much from China. That's my take on it. If the economies get better, I mean, for example, Saudi Arabia and UAE can afford to do that, but can Oman and Kuwait, can they do it? Depending on how the economic growth takes on in the post-COVID, or we are talking about the post-COVID, but I'm sure how this growth takes shape in coming years. that would also, tell us a lot of, probably give us some indication as to how this geopolitics is going to be played in future, and the geoeconomics as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Meena. For a final question, because I don't, there's been so much presented that we're nearing the end of our time. But Meena, to follow one of the things you said, one of the things I found most fascinating after the JCPOA was put into effect is that a lot of Chinese firms thought it was going to be open season in Iran for all sorts of modernization and new development. And then Iran immediately turned to the French, the Germans, the Dutch, anyone in Europe as preferential treatment versus the Chinese. And there was actually a noticeable backlash in Beijing to that clear, what they saw as betrayal, considering all the kind of quiet work that China did in the JCPOA negotiations. But my final question to you is, imagine me as someone working in the American government, this isn't too far of a stretch, who is cynical of the long-term centrality of the Middle East. It certainly still matters, but the real game being played is in the Eastern Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific. And there we have allies and partners who want the U.S. to get involved in order to maintain institutional kind of system that has been in place for the last 60 or so years, that are worried about China in the same way that we are, that have concerns about Russia in the same way we do, have the same kind of concerns about certain issues related to the cyber and technological realm. And honestly, I'm just cynical and skeptical of the Middle East, because we're not saying, we have never said to any country like the Saudis, or the Emiratis, or the Qataris, or anyone that don't partner with China on economic concerns. It's just that anything that ties into the security realm that we have essentially provided for you, built your militaries, provided you the training, equipped you constantly for decades, don't get near that realm. And we see consistently that these states allow China or Russia or any other actor that the United States has concerns about to get near that realm. What would you say to me as an American policymaker to say, listen, here's what you need to understand about how the Middle East is perceiving this? I mean, this isn't purely just hedging bets. In some ways, I mean, it could be viewed as purposefully antagonizing the United States. That honestly, from an American bias, has spent a lot of money, has spent a lot of blood protecting the regimes that now seem to be kind of poking at us. Now, again, I'm not saying this is my viewpoint, but this is something that commonly exists in conversations in Washington. How would you respond to that as someone who does not have an American viewpoint, or is based in the Middle East and has access to different information?
Well, I would say emotions and relationships, international relationships and emotions are very two different things. International politics, if it is their national interest to play the China card to get maximum they can from the US or from China, that's what they would do. They are driven by their national interests. If the West can offer competitive or cheaper AI and 5G technology, they will go for that too. So, but at the same time, there is a political need for them to have to play the China card. If they were playing only the China card politically only, there will be no reason for any angst in the US. But the problem is that they're also playing the China card technologically, and that has security implications. So we have to talk to them and make them aware of the downside of China's digital Silk Road, digital penetration of the states and societies, long-term consequences. This could lead to African Union headquarters built by the Chinese company. It's a very good example how it was hacked. With all the data was going through servers in Shanghai. So the downside of too much reliance, putting too many eggs in one basket. I think COVID, in that sense, is a positive development. One shouldn't say that pandemic is a positive development. It would say an eye-opener, because it makes us aware of the downside of putting all the eggs in one basket, the need to diversify. And countries in this part of the world are into diversification big time. They want to diversify their foreign policy, foreign partners. They want to diversify their economic partners. They want to diversify their technology partners. So if other cheaper, better options are available in terms of AI and 5G satellite navigation system, they would certainly opt for that. They also wanted to reduce their dependence on the US. They believe that they're too closely tied to the US, and then they don't get what they want from the US too. So they want to play this one off against the other game, and we can't blame them. Even though the US has, of course, invested a great deal of treasure and blood in maintaining these relationships, in maintaining this, the kind of stability that prevails in the region, and that has led to prosperity too. So that's my take on it. One concern I would say, yes, rich countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia are not bothered about China's infrastructure loans to poor developing countries. But we should realize that these countries are also competing for influence, or acquiring larger footprints, say in small island states in the Western Indian Ocean, Seychelles, Comoros, Madagascar, Maldives, Sri Lanka. So if these countries become too dependent on China, then that has implications. Then they face competition. Saudi Arabia, UAE would face competition from China in terms of their own regional ambitions, also within the Middle East and North Africa, and the eastern coast of Africa. So China could be a competitor, though it is not at the moment. But if China's footprint increases, then these countries that are supporting China in the years to come, decades to come, could see China as a competitor too. So there is something that to worry about for them in the future, but not at the moment.
Thank you, Mohan. Well said. Well said. Meena, if you don't mind going next to kind of my bias, I think based in Delhi, I think you would have a particular way of approaching what I just said. So what are your thoughts?
I think what you've asked me to put myself in the American shoe and then think as to how and what should be the Middle Eastern response and how Middle East, looks at it. First thing that, strikes me is as soon as, President Trump took charge, and, his Twitter diplomacy and various statements, and, that actually created a lot of confusion as far as the Middle East region is concerned. So that confusion led to, some kind of a lack of trust in the United States, and, Mr. Trump saying, you have to pay for what we've given you. It was more about the way, those speeches were delivered. And of course, subsequently, if you see the fact on ground, it is not that the United States has withdrawn. But, the perception has changed. I mean, we've been attending those Emirate policy centers debate. And that's where, when you listen to the regional perceptions, there is a perception that the US is going to withdraw. And I think that was a point when, and as it is, there was a lot of churning happening internally in these countries as well. And on the top of it, the Iran threat was growing. That was the key factor when we look at the GCC Iran dynamics unfolding there. And when we talk about expectation and how much US can deliver, so they realize that, look, should we be dependent on one power as such? And that's where the China got that space, and they felt, look, here are the economic opportunities. The Chinese leadership, the premier, he talked about the BRI, the MAGA project and how it will benefit. So that was all. And the Chinese were very successfully doing their diplomacy very quietly. You see the China's influence growing in Middle East in such a short span of time. So I think if I'm an American, I would like to read the mind of the Middle Eastern people, talk to the regimes and explain your position. Maybe there was much more expectations without realizing as to how much United States need to deliver and what on ground is a real situation. I mean, if I look at myself as an US, there's so much of criticism of the US policy in Middle East. The cases of Iraq are talked about. The cases of what is happening in Libya is talked about. Iran, the dilemma which the Middle East faces today is how do you manage these fault lines, which are existing today, and especially the role which Iran has played, and how do you manage Iran? I think that's the most difficult part. The Chinese and the Russians, they don't love Iranians, let me tell you. But at the same time, they would like to very much use Iran for their own interest, and that's what they've done. I mean, even today when we are talking about the Iran's pivot to the East, it is focused mainly on China and Russia. They are talking about the 25 years of agreement. How much Chinese are willing to deliver? Today we had some discussion on Chabahar, and that's when somebody asked that there was some kind of the new media report in Israel suggesting that the Chinese and the Russians have got some kind of excess in one of the Iranian ports from where they can collect the intelligence. Now, from my point of view, if I understand the Iranians, they would not like to surrender their sovereignty to the Chinese and the Russians. That's what I feel that the Iranians would never want to do it unless there are no options left with them. So for me, I think the United States need to carve out a new Middle East policy. In future, they need to look at the sensitivities, and particularly the policy on Iran. Iran needs to be contained, at the same time it needs to be engaged as well. There are forces within Iran which need to be engaged, and they would be the willing partner. But how you do it, I think that is the diplomatic skill which people have to work out, and that has to be phased out in different levels and layers. Once that problem is addressed, I mean, the youth in Iran, I can tell you that nobody wants any kind of a confrontation with the United States. But has the US succeeded in actually, using them for their own benefit and using that force? Unfortunately, that hasn't happened.
Thank you, Meena. That's great.
One can go on and on.
Oh, go ahead.
But I mean, I obviously can't. But from India's point of view, if I have to say, I mean, for India, stakes are pretty high. When we're talking about the Gulf, we have, if you look at the past. Since 2014, we've made it very clear that the GCC is important. Our cooperation with UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the GCC countries is much more important when we compare it with Iran. But Iran, of course, is regionally one actor which India cannot ignore for the geographical proximity to it and certain levers which Iran has, and India's sort of access to Central Asia and beyond, and Afghanistan particularly, which is both in India's interest and of course in the United States' interest. So India will have to play much more active role in Middle East. That is what, and it's a new kind of a role which it will have to carve out for itself. And I would say even for United States, there is a need to have a relook at its policy towards the Gulf and Iran and other sort of countries? Thank you.
I wish to make a very brief comment.
Quickly, please, Mohan, before we can move on to Jonathan.
Yeah, 2 points I want to make. One is that whether it is at the elite level or at the popular level, people are more comfortable with the West than with China. That's one. So we should always keep that in mind. Policymakers need to keep that in mind, that people and elites are more comfortable with the West than with China. Second point is that in terms of relations with you have to look at, there is no one size fits all countries. Different countries have different requirements, different needs. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then you have got Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar. You have to keep this in mind, that these countries, and then the developing countries in the MENA region, they have very different needs. So there is no one policy for the whole region. Much as we talk about the MENA region, we have to come up with policies that work to the advantage of both parties in this part of the world. Small states, developing states, and rich states, and big states. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jonathan, you were patient, so I'll turn to you.
Cool. Well, I guess all the good stuff's been taken already, but I'll see if I can come up with something. First, to respond to the point that Mohan just made about folks here being more comfortable with the West than China. Of course, but they've had decades and decades of exposure to the West, and China is a very new player in the region. And I've mentioned this a lot in my other speaking engagements. My students know almost nothing about China. They have a lot of exaggerated ideas about how important it is or how strong it is, but they don't know Chinese people, Chinese cultural products, Chinese film or literature yet. That'll change. If you ask somebody in Saudi in 1930 what they thought about the U.S., they knew nothing about it, right? Familiarity can breed contempt, but it also can breed more familiarity. So I think it's early days. We're going to see China start to play a bigger role. Students will go there. Students will come here. There's going to be that kind of exposure is going to start to take place. To your question, Jeff, about this policymaker whose feelings are hurt about the blood and treasure, and the Middle East is turning to our competitors after all we've done. I guess I would just gently remind him that politics, international politics in this region, are very much interest-based. And as Mohan said, I would try to keep the emotion out of it. Gulf folks here aren't working with the US because they like the US or they find it attractive, just like America doesn't like the Gulf or find it attractive. I think at the popular level, it's really interesting. American citizens at the popular level have almost everybody has a negative impression of the Middle East, but at the policy levels, they see the Middle East is quite important. It's kind of the opposite here, where most people like American at a popular level, cultural products or whatever, but they don't like it at the political level very much. So it's kind of an interesting contrast. So I guess what I'd say to this person is, consider it from an interest-based perspective. And I have to backtrack this on just a second. I saw an interesting campaign ad today featuring General Hayden saying, if Trump wins again, then perhaps all of our alliances will be shattered. And if that happens, then America could be alone. It's a very dramatic, obviously a political campaign ad, but it also did speak to, I think, a truth that America's alliance system has been a major pillar of its strength in the post-World War II era, and especially during the post-Cold War era. And it is quite in a perilous state right now in a lot of parts of the world. Now, Mohan had mentioned this, and Meena had mentioned similar points as well, that a lot of America's allies or partners have very deep interests in this part of the world. And so does China, its chief competitor. If the US isn't going to contribute, as distasteful as this person might find it, to securing this region, countries like Korea or Japan or Singapore or Indonesia or India right now don't have the capacity, and there is really no cooperative mechanism to facilitate this either. There is no kind of Asian multilateral organizations that focus on these types of things. So it would be a lot messier without the US playing a large role. And China, while it doesn't have the Blue Water Navy yet, it is building a lot of ports and parks, and it's got its second aircraft carrier. It could be in a position in the not too distant future to play a larger role, given its deep interest here. If I were talking to somebody in Beijing, I would say, hey, you've got to start making provisions for your own energy security. You can't rely on the good nature of America forever. So if America did say, we've done so much for this region and they don't appreciate it, let's leave, well, this is going to cause undue stress on your allies. It's going to benefit China. And also on the other side of the peninsula, which we haven't really talked about, which is also very important, the Red Sea is a pretty big choke point as well. And what China's been doing around the Arabian Peninsula with its ports and parks in Kizad, here in Abu Dhabi, and Duqm, and Jizan, in Saudi, and Djibouti, and Port Said, it's building an infrastructure, a commercial one at this point, but it's building a commercial infrastructure that takes it right to the Mediterranean. And if the US is going to say, well, we don't want to get caught up in this anymore, that gives China access to North Africa very easily and gives it a bigger role in the Mediterranean. And then you have to look at it from the European perspective too, and thinking, well, if the US is abandoning alliances, then the EU is going to start to behave in a more assertive, independent manner as well. So I would say, based on your interests, kind of suck it up and realize that you get a lot more out of this than you sacrifice. And it makes a lot more strategic sense to continue to play a bigger role. And in doing so, you get a bigger opportunity at setting the standards and shaping the way that the region's going in the future.
Well, all three of those were excellent responses and valuable. I mean, I put it in a harsh series of questions purposefully to try to get your kind of raw responses. We're at the end of time. In fact, we went over a little bit, and I apologize for that because I know it's evening for all of you. But before I say farewell, a couple of challenges to the three of you for feedback you can give to us at NESA in the future. And one is a way to frame. Clearly, when we're talking about major powers and what their interests are in the MENA region, we tended to focus on two. We brought up Russia. We brought up the Europeans. Obviously, India is interested in the region, but its capabilities may not yet allow it to exert its influence as far. So we're talking about the U.S. and China. What is the nature of this competitive relationship there? A way to, if not necessarily define it, a lens through which to view it. Because I think if we don't do that, it's going to be put it's going to be looked at through a lens that we don't necessarily find to be very accurate and clear. So if any of you come up with a way of doing that, please let me know. And then secondly, in relationship to kind of the mindset of kind of U.S. policy, incredibly helpful to understand it from the mindset of the region as it pertains to long-term interests. And I've always, I am a cynic of Middle East policy as it's been done over the past 20 years. I think the United States has kind of ignored the maritime domain and the coastal regions in favor of kind of, the Iraq policy and Syria and so forth. I think the special operations component needs to be there. But the naval component is key. And then beyond the military, I agree with the sentiment, all three of you, the diplomacy. We need to do pomp and circumstance around diplomacy better. A lot of work still is done. There's constant work by the embassies, but there's not a lot of bells and whistles and screaming from the rooftops. And I understand that was because of sensitivities in the region to American influence. But given we live in a different age, maybe bringing some attention to what the U.S. is doing would be of advantage. But anything you come up with, any ideas, concept, papers you write, please send them our way. We're happy not only to promote them and send them out to our alumni network, but to respond to them. So with that, Jonathan, did you?
Yeah, it's just when you said a way to frame it, and you saw, obviously, I went and got my hat. I'm a big baseball fan, and every time I see somebody from Washington, I have to do this because you stole our baseball team, the Montreal Expos. I think it just came to me when you asked a way to frame it, and it struck me as a baseball fan that the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry is a really good way of looking at it, because everybody in Boston and everybody in New York thinks it's the most important thing in the world, and everybody in the other 28 major league cities is just so sick of hearing Boston and New York talking about each other and how terrible they are. And that's kind of the way I see it, is, you know, there's a lot of middle powers, there's a lot of regional powers that have pretty deep interests, and we would all love it if China and the U.S. could, you know, stop having this narrative where those are the only two countries driving anything, because especially here, it's just so important that this rivalry just kind of it's so unproductive. It feels. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, the Yankees Red Sox. Mohan, go ahead.
In terms of how to frame it, looking to the future, I would say that U.S. needs to insulate its security relationship from other aspects of the relationship that these countries are forging with China. That's one. How do you maintain, promote, and insulate security ties from the negative consequences, unintended negative consequences of China's growing economic presence in the region? That's one. Second, countries in the region are pursuing look east policy. Look east policy is not look toward China policy. They are also trying to engage India, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia. You know, these all countries happen to be US friends and allies. So US needs to partner with these countries, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, exploit their competitive advantage in certain areas to enable them to carve out a larger presence in the region. That would work to US advantage.
All of that is well said. Meena, do you want to add something too?
One point to add. I think you brought out this, Jeff, about the maritime domain, and I completely agree with you that there's a golden opportunity for India, US, and the other like-minded countries, Australia, Canada.
Your signal's a little weak right now. I apologize for that. But I think I got the gist of what you were saying about the partnerships that are available and exist, and it's well taken. I will, Jonathan. I will not. But
yeah, I just wanted to say that there are opportunities for India, United States, Japan, and other countries to work in the maritime domain. That's what I'm saying. It is what, along with the Gulf partners, that's what I'm saying.
Well said, and I'm sorry about the connectivity there. It was but we got through it, and I agree. Jonathan, I will say that I'm not originally from DC, but I get your point about Red Sox, Boston. Well said and well thought of, and all three of you. But the offer is open. Anything you write, working on, even ideas, white papers, just scribbles on paper, all of that. We are building a community of people who are interested in these wider topics. So, but finally, to kind of conclude everything, thank all of you for carving out time this evening and joining us. We'll edit things, and when it's live, I'll send you the link. Don't be surprised if I bother you in the future. But in the meantime, I wish you all a pleasant evening, and thanks again.